Today, Cherish and I are going to discuss the Musée du Quai Branly, Jacques Chirac, as well as a piece of Benin art from the African collection. The Quai Branly was built by former President Jacques Chirac and opened in 2006. It combines the collections of the National Museum of the Arts of Africa and Oceania, as well as the Museum of Man, plus thousands of other acquired objects, featuring art from Africa, Asia, Oceania, and the Americas. In terms of location, the museum is along the Seine, near Pont de l'Alma, so extremely close to the Eiffel Tower. Walking up to the museum, I was instantly struck by the lush green garden surrounding the building. This garden is the complete opposite of a French formal garden. There's no symmetry, no lawns, no gates. Almost immediately, this museum is telling you that it's different, that it's not like other museums. The feeling that this garden gives off is that it's exotic, which is an impression that we got from much of the museum as a whole, and we'll be discussing further.
Not only is the landscape surrounding the building very different from other museums in Paris, but the building itself, most of Paris, you can definitely see the history of the city and the country in its physical form through buildings, like the Haussmann style of apartments and streets and things like this. But this, you can tell very much when you walk up to this building that it's very different from the rest of Paris. The exterior is very large, colorful, and contemporary. The path into the museum wraps around the building. Much of the building is elevated well above the ground, and there are these interesting geometric shapes all around the outside. With our ticket scan, we walked inside, and when you enter the building, you are met immediately with a series of paths that slowly transition from very bright spaces that are white walls and a lot of light coming in through the windows, a lot of natural and some artificial. And you start to feel like you're taking a journey into another world. The walls go from being very white, and the rooms go from being very much filled with light to darkness and cool colored walls.
We progressed up a long walkway that had a virtual installation called The River along the path. Created by Charles Sanderson in 2010, The River is a flowing stream of words and names. All these words come from the museum collection database, so names of places, people, terms, materials, etc. Now, the way the Quai Branly is set up is interesting, to say it nicely. The museum's permanent collection is essentially one giant room. There are sections for each region and continent, but there are no real barriers, so visitors can move from one area to another very easily. The lighting suggests that we are in an ancient world, or, as many of the colonizers who found these objects and artworks believed, a primitive world. Many pieces are lit from underneath, giving them a spooky or supernatural feeling. Other display cases only had one light on them when there should have been multiple, because there were multiple pieces. The windows are blocked out with forest decals, meaning that very little natural light actually gets into the building. And furthermore, the labels were either too hard to find, not descriptive enough, or not even lit up at all. Honestly, it was so dark in the museum that it was almost impossible to take good photos. The piece that we looked at was King Ghezo's throne, found in a section of other Benin art. It is dated to the 19th century. The throne is quite large and towered over both of our heads. It's intricately carved from wood and appears very smooth to the touch. It's also a very symmetrical piece, both in the overall shape and in the designs on the four sides. There are small metal hooks on the curved portion of the seat itself, though some are missing.
The piece is described in French on its label, and as I translate it, I read, this is more of a direct translation, but I'm trying to really get the meaning across. But for the ceremony dedicated to the deceased king of Dahomey, who preceded Ghezo, the king sat on the throne atop a platform. This was a display of the richness of kingship, and the King Ghezo, who reigned from 1818 to 1858, had this throne made in honor of the king before him. And the throne has a stature that recalls that of the Ashanti people of Ghana. The sculpture has mixed motifs, like the shells of Saint Jacques, and the technique originates from the Portuguese. This influence is explained by the exile of most craftsmen in 1807 of the Portuguese court in Brazil. It goes on to explain how the Atlantic slave trade also changed the style of architecture. The exile or siege, as it's often described in English, caused an entire generation of young craftsmen who grew up in Benin originally to grow up without the opportunity of seeing artworks in their original context or participating in their production. And as we know from our research, the art of Benin stretched back centuries, and the tradition of honoring the king who was passed was a duty of the next king. In fact, it was believed in order to be a great king and to ensure the kingdom would flourish, you would need to have a ceremony and a shrine to commemorate the work of the former king and acknowledge his presence as a spiritual being now. Many people, groups in the African continent have very strong beliefs in the existence or presence of their deceased in their daily life. It is very important to honor their ancestors. When the Europeans came, to places like Benin, it often disrupted this cultural practice along with many others. For example, the arrival of the Portuguese in the 15th century coincided with a period of great political and artistic development in Benin. Much of the subject matter also changed and began to depict more Europeans, and especially in battle scenes or court life, which became symbols of wealth to Benin people. When learning the history of that, it attaches to this work in a very distinct way. Seeing it now in its current context, all I could really say is that nothing has changed. The extent of power and wealth that the Europeans have had over the cultures of African people, among many other non-European people, continues to exist. Just the simple fact of this throne being in a European museum, a French museum, on display. A throne represents a monarchy, represents a king, represents a queen, represents power, wealth, status, and for that to be taken, it goes back to a lot of those ideas that, for example, with the Benin people, it's now held under the guise of exoticism, primitivism, and inferiority. It is displayed with a few lights in a dark museum, whereas the Europeans display their historical works of art in rooms filled with natural and artificial light, and usually in the original context of their country and culture. Just think, how strange would it be to see the throne of Louis XIV in the Benin City National Museum?
The imperial past of France truly hovers over this museum. Many of the works we see in the Quai Branly today come from former French colonies. While the museum touts itself as a public institution dedicated to the study, preservation, and promotion of non-European arts and civilizations, all it really is a perpetuation of the idea of otherness.